Hello, welcome to Collective Intellectualities, a new program where we discuss education in our world today from a wide range of theoretical and interdisciplinary perspectives. I'm Alex Means, and on this episode, my co-host Amy Sohote and I sit down with prominent educational philosopher Gert Biesta. Gert is a professor of public education at Maynooth University in Ireland and a professorial fellow at the Moray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. The discussion that follows explores a wide range of themes, including Gert's approach to philosophical inquiry, distinctions between learning and education in his work, the need to affirm risk and creativity in education, and democracy and education in our time of populist politics and Twitter culture. Please see the show notes for more detailed information on who we are, on PESA, and also for selected links to some of Professor Biesta's books and articles. We hope you enjoy the conversation, and we also hope you join us again in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to talk to you about your work, and we wanted to begin by asking you about your practice of reading, thinking, and writing. So how do you approach your own ongoing education, your work of studying and thinking? And to put this another way, how does one study as a philosopher of education?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to begin with. The first word that comes to my mind is intuitively and intuition. So for me, intuitions are really important. That's sort of where I get a lot of my thinking started, where suddenly I have a hunch or an idea emerges, and I have little control over that. Other than that, it has to do with the environments and the things that happen there and the things I see. And maybe the other word here is irritation. I often also get started when I encounter things that that don't make sense to me, or when I think a little bit through them, they become quite absurd, or there is something missing. So there is quite a lot of sort of an emotional level in my way of working. And I would also say it's in a sense reactive. So I don't have a particular scholarly program or things I want to pursue or develop, but I think I'm an observer of a lot of what's happening in education. And then there are things that sort of I have a gut feeling that there is something wrong or something missing. And then I begin to explore and begin to try to articulate what the issues may be. What helps me a lot is to talk about them, seminars, presentations, teaching. And I've noticed over the years actually that I don't distinguish a lot between those. So I find myself giving talks and lectures to students about the same topics that I give invited lectures. And that helps, I think, to begin to shape my ideas. And then, again, being quite reactive, I have opportunities where people invite me to write. And that often is the point where I then sit down and say, okay, what are the issues? What's the intervention that may be needed? How can I build up a case? And then my reading begins to start. I think over the years I've read an awful lot. I'm not a systematic reader, but I read in function of things that interest me or that I want to find more about. And that has built up over the years. So that's an interesting kind of resource you can fall back on. And then, what I try to do is to make points and to work towards observations or conclusions. And often then I like to play with language, and words arrive, and they also help to begin to to articulate things. That's probably as much as I can tell about what I do. So a lot of it, yeah, just happens, you could say. So it's always nice then to think back.
So we're going to dig just a little bit deeper into that.
Sure, yeah.
You talked about intuition, irritation, and reaction. So we're as part of this, they're probably all imminent to what you do. They not necessarily in sequence, but you have written that any act of creation, including education, is at best a dialogue between one's intentions and the material one works with, and thus a process in which both have a voice and both have a role to play. So you, in your work, you dialogue with a wide range of thinkers, from John Dewey, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Rancière, Hannah Arendt, and others. How do you conceive of your relationship to these philosophers in this sort of process that you have? Are they teachers? Are they muses? Are they distant friends, neighbors, or colleagues? Also, how do you navigate the conceptual tensions across these thinkers in your work?
I think many of these authors are first of all sources of inspiration. So I think I go to them, or I've gone to them because I thought there was something interesting in their work that I wanted to pursue and to find out what they were doing. And there is a small number of people, and I think that the names you mention are, fairly central in that. I did my PhD on John Dewey, so I still need to get rid of Dewey. That's my main ambition. All the others have contributed over the years. And I think what they do, they provide ideas, they provide language. But I think the most significant thing I take from that interaction are ways of thinking. That's what has stayed with me from pragmatism. Not so much all the theories or the positions, but that you always go back to what is the question. That for me is really what pragmatism offers, that it starts with a question and never with taking a position. I think that the same with Derrida. There is also, I find Derrida very systematic and very logical. But there is a particular logic, and as soon as you sort of see what that logic is, it generates, it begins to generate questions and ways of doing and turning things around. So you can say it's inspiration, but it's also, a bit, what is it, borrowing or using or getting inspired by the ways in which they raise questions or make things visible. That's probably the best way to describe it. And at points in time, some thinkers are more prominent than others, so that also depends a bit on what I'm doing, but there are some that keep coming back. And there are also phrases and formulations that suddenly strike me, and then I think, oh, there is something there. And out of that, you can, develop your own thinking. So again, not very systematic, although looking back, I think I've read a fair bit and tried to really work to understand what these thinkers were after. Conceptual tensions, I'm not too bothered about that, actually. Maybe because I'm a bit lazy as well. But also because for me, the work is about, developing arguments and thoughts and language in the here and now. So that, for me, you can say is theoretical work. You have to push yourself forward. And yeah, you can use all kind of resources. But for me, the work I try to do is never to say, oh, I need to get this philosopher right and that philosopher right, and that's what I do. I try modestly to sort of say, no, I try to theorize myself, but you always do that in interaction with what other people have done.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because too, when you're talking about how you're engaging across this diverse group of thinkers, and also just in the response to the question, it noticed some resonance with how you write, because in reading your work, we have appreciated there's a pedagogical quality to your writing as you're thinking through and interacting with the different philosophers. So like its tempo, its pace, and also there's like a level of care and attention when you're going through with the different thinkers. And we think, you know, you have created something of a distinctive style and aesthetic sensibility, I think would be a good way of putting it, which requires time and focus and slowing down, right? So how conscious has this been for you? And how do you, if you do conceptualize your writing as an aesthetic sensibility and also as a form of pedagogy?
It has initially not been very conscious because English is my second language. So even to get a flow in the English language, that took a while. And for me, that meant that I was much more sort of on the inside of language and trying to discover what the possibilities were than that I did that from the outside. I'm also someone who needs to write in order to figure out what I'm thinking. So pursuing the language is important there as well. The other thing is I started out in education as a physics teacher. And to teach physics well, I think also requires a lot of precision. I was really not a very good student of physics in secondary school. So I always had trouble with teachers who were at home in physics and yeah, they explained something and then I was just sitting there and they said, can't you see it? And I said, no, I can't see it. Then the only thing they could say is, well, look again. But of course, if you don't know what you should see, you cannot see anything. And what helped me, and then also my own teaching, is to find ways of going back to a point where you can meet a student, even with something very simple, and then to begin to build it up step by step. And I think it's still from that practice of teaching that I have a bit of my own writing and thinking style, that I need to be able to follow through all the steps in order to get somewhere. That's at least a trace I recognize. And what I find really funny, there are people who like my work because they say that it's so clear. There was once a reviewer of a book, and he said that my work was too clear. And I found that funny. Also because he suggested I should make my writing more complicated. And I think, but that's impossible. Writing is not that tool where you can just say, oh, now I do complicated and now I do easy. So, yeah, I think it has something to do with that I need to be able to construct an argument that has all the steps sort of in a logical place. And that gives a certain slowness, a certain transparency. At the same time, I think my writing is also not clear at all. So at one level, there are also all kinds of things happening that are not entirely in my own control. So there is always this dialogue with that language also takes you somewhere. And I know as a writer that I also play with things and put little things in the text. And again, it has something to do with my teaching as well, I think. It's very difficult to sort of be too aware about your teaching and your writing, because then before you know it, it becomes a trick. So that's why I'm a bit hesitant. But I would say if people would ask how I would characterize my writing and my teaching, I would say it has a performative quality. For me, writing and teaching is to put something on the table, to put something in front of your readers, to put something in front of your students, but not trying to determine what they do with that, but at the same time doing the best you can in putting something there that has substance, that has coherence, that maybe has beauty. But for me, I always want to sort of, in a good sense, irritate my students so that they come forward. Sometimes you push that a bit artificially, sometimes it just happens. And that's something that's somewhere in my writing as well, I think. Because I'm not interested in whether people just follow what I write. That's not the interesting thing. I want them to meet it and do something with it. That's pedagogy, I would say.
It's almost like it sounds like a creating a catalyst for the reader or student.
It's difficult to find the right language for it, because it's definitely not sort of a constructivist pedagogy or a learner-centered pedagogy. The opposite is the case, I would say. But I see teaching very much as putting a reality in front of your students and invite them, but also push them and force them to say, okay, now you have to engage with this reality. And at some point then, as a teacher, I step back and I say, it's your work. It cannot be my work.
Mm-hmm. This might be a good place to transition into a slightly different terrain, because now you're sort of transitioning to the educational encounter itself and getting at a bit about the kind of theory of education that you've developed. So you, in a trilogy of books, you make reference to the idea that you've developed something like a theory of education. And this stands in tension to the sort of omnipresent language of learning, the politics of learning, the learning society. So could you elaborate on this tension between learning and the theory of education that you've developed, and sort of draw out the content of each of these that sides of this tension?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking where to begin. I've become more and more convinced that learning and education have very little to do with each other. But the challenge is to make clear why that difference is there. So one argument is to say anyone who wants to learn can learn. You don't need education for that. You can even say at one level, we are constantly learning. So why think that education is needed for learning? That already shows that there is some kind of gap. And at least it makes clear to me that the point of education is not to make learning possible. Now, one way to get then a bit more precise is that you can still say, well, let's assume that learning is the concern of education. Then you can say the job of education is to make a particular kind of learning possible. So it's about directing learning or steering learning. And there is some reason for that, some also in a very practical sense. So you can say children who live on the street learn all kinds of things, and they learn very useful things, but there are also opportunities they will never get simply because of the economic and material circumstances. So there you can say that one good argument for the school, for educational institutions, is to say at least we try to give everyone an opportunity to learn more than what they would just learn in their own situation. That you can still say sort of in terms of learning, and then you give learning a place in education. One concern I have is that when you really zoom in on the word learning, it evaporates. There is actually nothing there, I think. And again, I have a number of ways of trying to make that point. When you look at how we use the word learning, you can come up with all kinds of statements where we say, yeah, that looks like a meaningful sentence, like learning to ride a bike, learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning to be patient, learning that you're not good at something. But the odd thing is that if these are all cases of learning, then they are so different that you cannot assume that there is some underlying process that is the same in all these examples. That's why I just cannot understand why people say we have learning sciences or we can study learning. Maybe there are many different learnings, or we use that word to refer to many different processes. And then there are more concerns about learning. So if you ask what is learning, when do we say that someone has learned something, we basically say, well, when someone has changed in some respects. So at point A, you weren't able to do something. At point B, you are able to do something. Then you can say, oh, that person has learned something. But then we actually say not much more than that change has happened, and that we value that change or don't value the change. So then you begin to see that word learning is actually a judgment we make retrospectively. They can also say, so in the situation itself, actually, we never know whether we will change and how we will change, which also means that we can never say that we are right now learning. So for me, there are a lot of problems with the word learning, and as soon as you begin to pin it down, actually it disappears. And therefore I find it actually a very problematic word. I think I always, also when my students use the word, I always say, can you come up with another word that is more descriptive or more precise, or helps to say what we're really talking about. But also, and I realize this has something to do with language as well, and the language in which I grew up. For me, education actually is first of all a verb, and I would say education is a form of intentional action. In English, you don't immediately get that with the word education because it can also refer to a process. But in Dutch, the words there are all very clearly sort of words that refer to the activities of an educator. And that's my other point where I think, well, education only exists when there are educators. So the focus of our theorizing should be on the work that educators do, or that they, I have this category of intentional non-action. As educators, we often also don't do something, but we do that for good reasons. So there are a lot of intentions for not doing something, staying silent or not interfering. So for me, there is a very wide gap between the discourse of learning and the discourse of education. And yeah, on the one hand, I think the word learning actually lacks precision. So each time someone uses it, I am actually not sure what they mean by it. And that's worrying because it has become so big. But I also think it's far more interesting when we are in the field of education to think about, well, what do we do as educators then? And for me, theories of education have to focus on that.
So I think that's also too, I like when you're talking about how education, right? I guess the limitations of language, right? Especially here with English, it's like very there's not as much movement with it. It's like a very brick or something, to say the least. But I think that ties into when you're talking about, say, your book, The Beautiful Risk of Education, and when a lot of your writing, you stress how it's important to resist education's tendency towards prescriptive techniques and instrumentalization. So what you have called the formalization of the school curriculum. In contrast, you've written that there is that inherent risk to education, and that actually it's, rather than being averse to it, we should see it as an affirmative process, and productive. And so with risk being central to the creativity that is education. And we would love if you could maybe speak more to that, because, how is risk positive and affirmative rather than something to be, averse to?
Yeah. So, yeah, again, I need to think where to start. Of course, it depends on what you think that education is or that education is for. So if you conceive of education as a process that should produce something that you already know, then you want to make sure that you get that end result. And all the risk and openness and unpredictability are all then seen as hindrances to getting where you want to get. And that's, of course, what I play with saying, well, wait a minute, risk is not just a problem. You can say it's only a problem if you think that the process should be a predictable process. And then I begin to ask, well, is that a valid way to think about education? And in a sense, I'm quite liberal, so I can see reason in a lot of different positions. So I also know, it's important that students get it right and that they get the right understanding and the right skills. So there is a place for that, but there is also a limit there. And in rather crude and quick terms, you can say that the limit is when students can only appear as objects that need to be managed by teachers or by education systems. And there I come out of at least a continental tradition, but there are many more traditions that say at the end of the day, the point of education is that students can lead their own life. And that is what we constantly should be anticipating in all kind of really interesting ways. And that is risky because you give everything ultimately you put everything in the hand of the student and you say, look, it's your freedom. And I'm not the person who is going to tell you what you should do with your freedom. And then you can say, well, without risk, without the risk that this is an open process where you do not know what's coming out of it, but also the risk of saying to students, look, it's your life, it's up to you. There are all kind of risks there, but they are the point of that way of looking at education. And then risk becomes positive, and you can say necessary and essential for education.
So coming back to the student and perhaps the student and the educator as subjects, the question of the subject is central in your work and your philosophy of education. So why a subject and not a person or an individual? Why a subject and not a student or a teacher? For viewers and listeners who may not be as familiar with your approach to the subject in education, can you describe the difference between to be subjected and subjectification, or becoming subject, and what roles these play in your philosophy of education?
I can try, but it's also it's nice and appropriate that you point at some of these issues and words, because that's another part of the process where you start with an idea and you think, okay, I've got it sorted. And then people begin to respond and they say, well, do you mean this and not that? And then actually what initially you thought, I'm done with that, you need to revisit in order to find all the nuances. So this whole idea of subjectification is also part of that process. But I still like the term a lot. And this is an idea that comes straight from inspiration from Hannah Arendt, who says that the beauty of the word subject is precisely its double meaning. That to be a subject means to be the origin of action, the origin of initiative. And that is, you can say, part of our experience of existing as a subject of our own lives. But she says, and I think that's a brilliant insight, the only thing we as individuals can do is to take initiative, to begin something. But for that initiative to become real, to arrive in the world, in the social fabric, other people need to take up our beginnings. That's her language. And again, I really like the language. And then she says that means that if we want to exist in the world, we are therefore subjected to what other people do with our beginnings. And she says, and again I agree, it's this double movement of initiating something, but at the same time being subjected to what is beyond your control. That is what it means to exist as subject. And that's what I like about the word. So, and there are people who don't like it because they only hear subjection, and they say we don't want to be subjected. I also have to say my colleagues in England make that point often, where they say what really frustrates us here is that legally we are subjects of the monarch, not free citizens. So the word comes with that history and that experience as well. But all the other words like individual, person, they don't have this tension sort of in the word itself. That's what I like about it. And then subjectification is a difficult word because it suggests a kind of process. And what I've tried to do is to say, no, subjectification is an event. So for me, it's not a becoming. It's not that you become more of a subject when you get older or wiser or more skilled. Subjectification is an event, you can say, where your subjectness suddenly is at stake. And that's what I like about it as well, that you can say, I cannot produce my own subjectivity. I'm in a sense totally dependent on what occurs in my life, what happens in my biography. And out of that, you have to make your own life. And there are moments where there are questions that really come to you, and where you can say, become subjectified or discover that it's up to you there to do something. And for me, you can say that's the event of subjectification. And it disappears after that again. So you cannot say, okay, now I'm here and I'm here for the rest of my life.
If so, subjects are always in the world, and the world and subject have a complex relationship. Could you speak a little bit more about the relationship between subject, world, and education in these dynamics of subjectification that you're talking about?
That's a brilliant question. I think it goes to the heart of, something important and difficult at the same time. Because you can say, why education? Why isn't the encounter of subject and world enough? What do educators need to do there? And I find that an important question. So even if you say, here we have a theme that as educators we understand is really important. We don't want our children to become clones of us. We don't want to keep control over them. They must lead their own lives. The question is then, is there anything educational to do there? And I think there is. And again, you have to be very careful and quite precise. Because education is not always necessary. There are children, young people who grow up who, in the encounter with the world, meet these questions, meet themselves, and a lot goes well. I think part of what I do in my work is to look at the world and say, we are constantly creating worlds that pull all of us in different directions. Over the past years, I've been writing quite a lot about this idea of the impulse society, and the whole idea that we have an economic system that constantly wants us to buy more, that constantly tries to multiply our desires so that more stuff can be sold. You can say there we create an environment in which it becomes pretty difficult to stay standing. So it undermines, you could say, the possibility to exist as subject. And then you can say that's a point where education may want to step in. Maybe to keep this world at a bit of a distance. So I use this phrase to give the new generation at least a fair chance at their own subjectness. And if you say, well, just step into the world and you'll find what you need to find, then we may be a bit too naive or too optimistic, because this world has a dynamic of its own. So there is something there. I also tried to articulate that in this title of Obstinate Education, to say the one basic gesture of education is to resist, to push back, but it's precisely to push back so that something remains possible. So there you can say there is maybe a task for education. The other phrase I found in a text from Jacques Rancière, where he says he writes the task of the emancipatory schoolmaster is to refuse the students the satisfaction of not having to think for themselves. And if you take that a bit bigger, you can say that what he's saying there is the task of the educator is to refuse the student the satisfaction of not having to be a subject. For me, that's another way where this question of world, student, and educator comes into a particular relationship, where, of course, we can never force our students to be subjects, but we can try to undermine the satisfaction that we all get from not having to be a subject, where we just say, well, tell us what to do and I'll do it, but it's not me, it's your responsibility. So to keep that space open and to keep pushing there, and in that sense, you can say to dissatisfy or disappoint your students, that's part of the educational gesture as well.
I like how you put that. I mean, so as you're talking through this, the subject in the world, how do you conceptualize pedagogical responsibility and also the authority in education, and also related to how you're talking about that it's related to freedom and emancipation? So
so there is a pedagogical responsibility, and in one sense it's very abstract, and that raises a very big question: where does it come from? But also, why do educators even think that they can occupy that place and say, yes, I have this responsibility? But in an abstract sense, it is a concern for the subjectness of the new generation, the possibility for the newborn child or the new student arriving in the classroom to exist as subject of their own life. That is what gives orientation to the pedagogical responsibility. But then the risk returns, because the way I analyze it is by saying everything we do as educators always comes unwanted. There is never a child who is born and says, I want you to be my parent. So we find ourselves in a very odd situation where we feel that we need to do something, but the child is not able to ask us to do it. And there you are immediately in a power relationship. That is something that I think is really important just to acknowledge for anyone who works in education, that everything we do is in the first instance always an act of power. Now, of course, it comes with a lot of good intentions, but that doesn't take the power away. And therefore you can say, and that's how I also put it, that as educators, we always risk ourselves in everything we do that comes with an educational intention. Yeah, we put ourselves at stake because we interfere. We say to a student, oh, I think it might be good for you if you read this book, or if you follow this curriculum, or if you take a bit of responsibility for what's happening in this setting. Whether that power ever becomes authority, and with authority, I use that word to say authority is acknowledged power, or it's, authority is a relational concept, and power is a unidirectional concept. What students can do, what children can do, is that at some point they can turn back and say to the parents or the teachers, that was bloody irritating what you did, but now I see that actually it worked out well, or it was not too bad for me, or actually I deserved it. But when we were in the middle of that, it was horrible. But you can say at the point where the student turns back and say, I can now see that what you did there actually brought me closer to something, then suddenly power transforms, or it's a process of metamorphosis. It becomes authority. The trouble is that a lot of students leave school before they ever come to that point, or students realize it internally, but they won't tell you. So all that is also what, as an educator, you have to carry with you, that you do not know what you do there, or what sort of the outcome may be. You can then say educators are the problem, let's get rid of them because they are constantly exercising power. But I think that educators understand that this is a kind of, well, necessary evil already sounds a bit too easy. But you can say this is our job, that we are in this predicament, and there's no other way to do it. So that for me speaks to this whole question of pedagogical responsibility and authority and power.
It sounds like, in some ways, to simplify a bit, educators create the conditions in which new things can emerge in relation to the student's subjectness, so that new forms of responsibility can be sort of apprehended in relation to the world. And one of the things that's been very interesting over the last, say, 5 or 10 minutes listening to you, if we go back to one of the previous questions we asked about how you negotiate tensions between different philosophers. Now, you said you weren't interested in that as a kind of problematic that needs to be dwelt on. But one of the things that's been interesting is to hear how there's been a little bit of a Foucault that's haunted us in relation to power, and also eventalization, but also the questions Rancière raises around the necessity of the event of democracy, which is really kind of where I want to take this, and then the subject and world with a rent. And it's been very interesting to hear how those voices have been speaking just a little bit in some of these conceptualizations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But this idea of letting something emerge and creating the conditions for an emergence in education, you know, it necessitates having to accept some uncertainty and risk, et cetera, et cetera. How does that sort of formulation then relate to the relationship between education and democracy? How are creating those conditions related to the conceptualization of democracy that you have? And perhaps also, I mean, there's these other attendant questions of freedom and emancipation that are important. I'm not sure that your conceptualization of freedom and emancipation are the same. There's probably a useful difference between these terms. And I've read your work as taking emancipation more from Rancière, at least in the last maybe 5 to 10 years or something like this. I'm being a little bit long-winded in this question, but these are the things I'm sort of interested in hearing you talk about.
Yeah. I have to say that in some of the formulations you used, I get a bit nervous. It's like creating the conditions so that things may emerge. That to me sounds a bit too constructivist. So I get what you say there, and at the same time, so part of me would say, no, there is still something wrong there that needs more precision. The same with responsibility. I'm inclined to say that what I'm not after as an educator is responsibility. I don't want my students to be responsible. I don't want to make them responsible or to force them to responsibility. I would probably say I'm interested in that they meet their freedom. So there is a subtle difference there, but the word responsibility can quickly go wrong, where you say, so what do we ultimately want? We want our students to become responsible citizens or something like that. And this is inspired by Levinas, for example, where he would say the whole point is that we encounter a responsibility, and that is precisely the moment of subjectification. But what we do in that moment is not that we find a demand to be responsible, but that we find a demand to be the subject of our own life. So that is much more about freedom, you could say, than that it is about responsibility. So there is something, there to be aware of, and it's not always clear to me. But when people begin to talk about my work in moral terms, I tend to push back precisely for these reasons. Now, what does that mean for education and democracy? I don't know. So it's quite
That's
an
fair.
open moment. Yeah. So I've written quite a lot about democracy because I think there is something really important about it, that democracy refers to the situation, ambition, ideal that all human beings can be subject. And so that you can say that's an Arendtian reading of democracy. And then you can immediately see that that doesn't mean that everyone can just do their own thing, but that everyone sort of is willing to constantly hover in this middle ground where you're subjected to all the things that are beyond your control, but that are the very possibility for you to be there in the world as well. I think that's where my interest in democracy lies. That is quite political, you could say. It's very closely related to Arendt's idea of action. And there I see the connection also with Rocher, who says the democracy can never exist as sort of a positive state of affairs. The only thing we can hope for are moments of democratization, where this whole question of equality gets re-articulated. And we're not looking for more equality, but suddenly see that we need a different equality. And what I like about Rocher is that he sort of says, don't think that democracy is this utopia we put in the future and step by step we will get there. So there will always be the inequality, but all the political struggles are there to see there are different ways to configure and reconfigure equality. And that, for me, shows something of the ongoing trouble, you could say, with democracy, that I also find in Arendt. And that, for me, then, as an educator, speaks back to this whole idea of subjectness, which is very different from identity or individuality. But this existential condition, this existential appeal, maybe this existential burden. So democracy is somewhere there. And for that reason, the question of the relationship between education and democracy, is quite messy here, I would say.
Well, speaking of messy, you know, Western liberal democracies are having a lot of problems right now and a lot of trouble. And one of the things that we noticed is that you had stated that you would no longer be on Twitter as long as Donald Trump remained president. So this is by way of sort of some parting thoughts from you. Have you rejoined Twitter? But also importantly, in relation to Twitter, we are wondering how the philosophy of education, and particularly your perspectives on democracy and education, can speak to the new realities of the technological ecosystem, digital culture, social media, post-truth. And I'm kind of wondering what you even think of the idea of post-truth, because I think that you might have some interesting ways of breaking that whole idea down. But and then, of course, the rise of authoritarian politics that's embedded within all of these phenomena.
Yeah. Gosh, okay. Just a few quick final statements.
Well, you can take your time. We're not in a hurry.
So I'm not back on Twitter. I think I put on my website, I will rejoin when Trump has left. So some other people have asked me recently, when will you be back on Twitter? And I would probably say, but it's a bit quick. There are still too many little Trumps on Twitter. Maybe I don't want to be part of that dynamic. And I fully understand Twitter can also do wonderful things. The uprisings about 10 years ago in some countries, yes, Twitter had a lot of positive to do there, but it also, what does it do? I think it undermines possibilities to even be aware of our own subjectness. So there, for me, there is still a concern, because Twitter is quick. It's this immediate, this instant gratification. You feel an urge and it's already out there. It's not dialogical in any meaningful sense. It's a fighting match. It's a hit and then the hit back, or nothing at all. So there, in that sense, there is something, problematic, I think, about the medium. The question you ask is, what does philosophy of education have to do there? Maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I would take that question more in terms of what can philosophy of education or educational theory do in the public sphere. And the public sphere for me is everything that is orientated, you could say, towards another old-fashioned notion that needs unpacking, but an idea of the common good, or anything that's not just my private or particular interest. And there, that for me, again, has to do with this double meaning of subjectness, that I would say the only way in which we can ultimately exist is if we acknowledge that we cannot exist in a pure form. I think the desire for 100% purity is really dangerous, but it's widespread. And there are all kinds of systems that feed that desire. You know, advertising does a lot by saying, you've got an image of what your body should look like, we can get you there, 100%. But the same in politics, populist politics that says, you have a desire, vote for me, I'll give you that desire, 100%. And of course, those are lies, but they have a strong appeal. And what they do is constantly, in a sense, dampen or hide the idea of the common good, if you put it positively, or this irritating fact that our lives are not completely in our own hands. And each time we try to take it completely in our own hands, individually or collectively, actually something goes wrong. And to remind, each other of this is one thing where I would say education has something to do in that political discussion, because you can say this is kind of an educational point. How can we help each other? How can we give each other a fair chance at our subjectness? And not to think of that as something that can be pure and can be under our own control. These are the key insights that educators work with. But for me, they are also political insights, and they become more urgent, you can say, when society and politics become more infantile. So there is, for me, a concrete educational point to make in response to a lot of these political developments. Now, how we get that point across, not when we talk the language of learning, I think. But if we talk the language of education, of the difficult but urgent, Philippe Mérieux, a French scholar I really like, says this is the urgency of education. that we go to these points and help to keep this space open so that subjectness remains possible. That there is an argument to make there, but it's that argument. It's not the argument of lifelong learning or scoring high in PESA. All that are distractions, to put it politely.